Judith, thank you very much. I chose just a small number of slides to illustrate the things that we wanted to say. So we promised you last year that we would engage in an investigation about density. Lisette set out what she wanted us to do. We published 2 reports in the last 7 months. Those reports are the product of a huge survey of ULI members. 300 of you participated. Thank you for that. Workshops in Istanbul, Dresden, Berlin, Warsaw, Birmingham, Stockholm, London. Thank you to the people who hosted those workshops. An advisory group that included Rosemary Feenan and Michael Spies and Andy Martin and Brian Moran and many other people. Thank you for all the help there. And what we've done is 2 reports, a big literature review, 12 small case studies, 6 really detailed case studies, and a big survey. And all of it's on the ULI Europe website, and it's all available there to have a look at. And what we've really learned from this is Richard Rogers and I obviously had the same dream last night because Richard said very clearly about the correlation between density and environmental performance, and I'm very grateful that he did that, because when we reviewed the literature from the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, and all of the other global organizations, this relationship between environmental performance and density is absolutely underlined in the way that Richard said. But what I think surprised us was the relationship between density and economic performance. Ug has made a wonderful case about the relationship between density and competitiveness. But let's also remember the relationship between density and innovation, density and proximity, density and interaction, density and digitization, density and the shared city. And so this relationship between economic performance of cities and density came through very clearly in our case studies, as did a point that Richard made about the troubling concerns about ghettoization, the relationship between sprawl and the spatialization of income distribution, if we can use that language. In other words, there's a relationship between density and social and economic cohesion that's now become very important and very clear. So except in a very, very few cases where there's a particular kind of industrial structure or a particularly inherited geography, density is basically good for the environment, good for the economy, and good for society, and the evidence is overwhelming now. As Ug also said, we did quite a lot of work on trying to differentiate between what we slightly crassly call good density and bad density. This is a very simplistic binary way of thinking, I accept that, but it's very helpful because it allows us to observe, if you like, the lessons from the past and what we've learned about the ingredients of good density, and Ug has brilliantly demonstrated them in everything he said. And what was most important to us, I think, is to assert 2 points. One, it's possible to really delineate what is good density and what is bad density now. We know the ingredients, we know how to build good density, we know how to resist bad density, but even more important, and I think the La Défense case study shows this very well, is how to transition from a density that has some elements of bad density towards a density that has the elements of good density. In other words, density can be transformed into something that really works. And this is not just the experience of La Défense, it's also the experience in Brooklyn, it's the experience in Canary Wharf, it's the experience in Marina Bay in Singapore, it's the experience in Poblenou in Barcelona, it's the experience in many places. So we know about that now. We also looked at the role that density plays in different kinds of cities at different points in their trajectory, Judith. And one of the things that was really obvious to us was that in fast-growing cities like Istanbul and Stockholm and London, density plays a critical role in really adding capacity and adding adaptability as population growth and economic growth threatens to choke the city, as long as Leif said extremely clearly, there's political courage and leadership, particularly around infrastructure. In cities like Warsaw and Birmingham, where there's a sense of recovery and a restructuring going on, density can also play another role, a role of creating a new signature for the city, new centres, creating new amenities, providing a new kind of attractiveness in the context of wanting to be competitive. But in a city like Dresden, which is getting used to a new population base, which is lower than its historic peak, density also plays a role in consolidating activity around new, smaller cores, creating the opportunity to cluster amenities and assets in certain places so that you can rebuild again with a smaller city, but nonetheless enjoying the vibrancy and the dynamism that comes from density. And this was very important insight, that different kinds of cities at different points in their evolutionary cycles can use density to achieve different kinds of goals. The psychology of density emerged as a really interesting element of the conversation. And Richard talked compellingly about this and the need, in a sense, to have a density which is acceptable, a density which is welcomed, a density which is people-oriented. We discovered in our conversations that there's several dimensions to this. Of course, there's the whole idea about creating places where people feel they belong, that sense of identity, that sense of participation. And Hugues was really just talking about that in relation to La Défense. But there's also the fact that different demographic groups have different kinds of appetites for urban lifestyles now, and that there are opportunities for districts to make very specific propositions, as it were, to different groups. And we look quite carefully at young people, older people, people in retirement. The densification of what we might call the elderly is a really interesting phenomena in our society these days, and the role that cities play in the welfare of people in the third age of life has become really key. Also, the role, for example, of urban education in improving the attractiveness of the city for parents with young children is a really interesting new phenomena, especially in Europe. So, if you like, there's different kinds of appeals of density for different people at stages in their own life cycles, as well as this very interesting conversation about identity, negotiation, the incremental approach. And then the last slide is this one. We tried to articulate a kind of new equation on density. What are the ingredients in any city that make it likely that progress with density will happen? Because let's be frank, there are more people who say that density is a good idea than there are cities that are actually building densely. Sprawl is still, in many senses, a kind of norm from which we're trying to reverse. So these 9 ingredients organized in 3 themes, getting the fundamentals of leadership and vision, plan and branding right, getting the execution right with tactics and scale and the financing, the legal and land use tools, and then getting momentum right with that positive psychology, the stimulation of demand, the multi-cycle approaches. What we were able to do, Judith, is identify this new equation on density, and then we looked at the cities that we studied, and we were able to score each of them in terms of how they perform on this equation. So it provides the initial basis for some benchmarking of cities. Which cities are ready for density and which ones are not, and why. And it provides us with a very simple but I think helpful diagnostic tool to explain why some cities are and some cities are not progressing with density and what they might need to do better. Now, we did this with our 6 case study cities, and the people who hosted the workshops in those cities will remember these conversations. But I've also started applying this to cities in Africa and Latin America and India and elsewhere, and actually it proves to be a very useful tool for conversation about why a city is or is not promoting the density that it feels it needs.